How was New York in 1830? A Journey Through America's Rising Metropolis. Chapter 1. The City's Physical Landscape and Geography. New York in 1830 stood at a remarkable crossroads between its colonial past and its explosive future. The city occupied the southern tip of Manhattan Island, stretching roughly from the Battery at the island's southern point to approximately 14th Street, though scattered development pushed northward in patches. Beyond this urban core lay countryside, farms, estates, and undeveloped woodland that would seem unimaginable to modern eyes. The street grid that defines Manhattan today was already taking shape, thanks to the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, which had established the famous rectangular pattern of numbered streets running east-west and avenues running north-south. However, in 1830, much of this grid existed only on paper. Below Houston Street, the older, irregular street pattern dominated, with narrow, winding lanes that followed the natural topography and the whims of early Dutch and English settlers. Streets like Maiden Lane, Pearl Street, and Stone Street twisted and turned, creating a maze that confused newcomers and delighted those who knew the city's secrets. Broadway stood as the city's grand thoroughfare, running diagonally across the grid from the Battery northward. It was already New York's most fashionable street, lined with shops, hotels, and theaters. The street's width, wider than most others in the city, made it ideal for promenading, and on pleasant afternoons it filled with well-dressed New Yorkers displaying the latest fashions from Paris and London. The waterfront defined the city's eastern and western edges, and both shores bustled with activity. The East River side, with its deeper waters and better protection from weather, hosted the majority of the city's shipping operations. Wharves and piers jutted into the river like wooden fingers, each one a hive of activity as sailing ships from around the world loaded and unloaded cargo. The smell of the sea mixed with tar, rope, fish, and spices from distant lands. The western shore along the Hudson River, though less developed for shipping in 1830, was beginning to see increased activity. The river provided a vital connection to upstate New York via steamboat, and the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825 had transformed New York into the gateway between the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes region. This geographical advantage would prove crucial to the city's economic dominance in the decades to come. Fresh water remained a persistent problem. The city's wells and natural springs could no longer meet the demands of a growing population approaching 200,000 residents. New Yorkers purchased water from vendors who transported it in barrels, often of questionable quality. The wealthy had cisterns to collect rainwater, but most residents made do with whatever sources they could find. This water crisis affected everything from public health to fire protection, and the lack of adequate water would contribute to devastating fires and disease outbreaks throughout the 1830s. The natural topography of Manhattan still asserted itself prominently. Hills, rocky outcroppings, streams, and ponds interrupted the urban landscape. Collect Pond, once a source of fresh water near present-day Foley Square, had become so polluted by tanneries and other industries that it was filled in during the 1810s and 1820s, creating swampy, unstable ground that would plague development for decades. Other natural features like Stuyvesant's Meadows and the salt marshes along the East River reminded residents that they inhabited an island, not simply a city. Central Park did not exist in 1830. The area that would become the park was a rocky, swampy landscape inhabited by scattered communities, including Seneca Village, a settlement of African-American property owners. The idea that the city might need a large public park was only beginning to emerge in the minds of forward-thinking citizens who visited European cities and envied their grand public spaces. Chapter 2. Daily Life and Domestic Arrangements. The rhythm of daily life in 1830 New York followed patterns dictated by natural light, manual labor, and strict social conventions. Most New Yorkers rose with the sun, as candles and whale oil lamps were expensive and provided limited illumination. Wealthy households might afford spermaceti candles, which burned cleaner and brighter, but most residents made do with tallow candles that sputtered, smoked, and filled rooms with an unpleasant odor. Housing reflected the city's rigid class divisions. The wealthy occupied spacious townhouses in fashionable neighborhoods like Greenwich Village, Bond Street, and Lafayette Place. These homes featured high ceilings, elegant furnishings imported from Europe, and sometimes even indoor plumbing, a remarkable luxury. The Federal and Greek Revival architectural styles dominated among the upper classes, with their symmetrical facades, columns, and refined proportions announcing the owner's wealth and taste. The emerging middle class, merchants, professionals, skilled craftsmen, lived in smaller but respectable homes, often in row houses that shared the wide walls with their neighbors. These residences might have 3 or 4 stories, with the family occupying the upper floors and the ground floor reserved for a shop or office. Furniture was simpler than in wealthy homes, but still substantial. Heavy tables, Windsor chairs, rope beds, with straw or feather mattresses. Working-class families crowded into tenements and boarding houses, often with multiple families sharing a single building. Entire families might occupy just 1 or 2 rooms, with minimal furniture and few possessions. Privacy was a luxury they could not afford. Windows, when they existed, often provided the only ventilation. And in summer, the heat became oppressive. In winter, residents huddled around fireplaces or small stoves, burning whatever fuel they could afford. Cooking took place over open fires or in primitive stoves. Women spent hours each day preparing meals from raw ingredients, as there were no refrigerators and few prepared foods available. Ice, harvested from northern lakes and rivers in winter and stored in ice houses, was available to those who could afford it, but most people preserved food through salting, smoking, drying, or pickling. Root cellars kept vegetables cool, and milk was delivered daily because it spoiled so quickly. The diet of 1830 New Yorkers varied tremendously by class. The wealthy enjoyed elaborate meals with multiple courses, soups, roasted meats, game, fish, vegetables, pastries, and imported delicacies like olives, anchovies, and preserved fruits. Middle-class families ate well, but more simply: bread, butter, cheese, seasonal vegetables, salt pork, beef, and chicken. The poor subsisted on bread, potatoes, onions, cheap cuts of meat, and whatever they could afford from street vendors. Laundry was an exhausting, all-day affair, typically undertaken once a week or even less frequently. Water had to be hauled from wells or purchased, then heated over fires. Clothes were scrubbed on washboards with harsh lye soap, rinsed multiple times, wrung out by hand, and hung to dry. Ironing required heating heavy flat irons on the stove and demanded skill to avoid scorching delicate fabrics. Many middle-class and wealthy families employed washerwomen to handle this grueling task. Personal hygiene standards differed greatly from modern expectations. Full baths were rare events, perhaps undertaken monthly or seasonally. Most people washed face, hands, and feet daily using a basin and pitcher, but immersing the entire body in water was considered time-consuming, expensive, requiring hauled and heated water, and potentially unhealthy. Deodorants did not exist, and body odor was a fact of life that people masked with perfumes, colognes, and scented powders among those who could afford them. Clothing marked social status unmistakably. Wealthy men wore tailored coats, waistcoats, trousers, or breeches, high collars, cravats, and top hats. Women's fashion featured empire waist dresses giving way to the fuller skirts that would dominate mid-century, along with corsets, petticoats, bonnets, shawls, and gloves. Fabrics like silk, fine wool, and imported cotton declared privilege. Working-class people wore simpler, more durable clothing made from cheaper materials, often homemade or purchased second-hand. Children dressed as miniature adults, and childhood as a distinct phase, with its own appropriate clothing, was a concept only beginning to emerge. Chapter 3. Economic Life, Commerce, and Industry. New York's economy in 1830 was experiencing explosive growth, driven largely by its position as America's premier port and the recent completion of the Erie Canal. The canal, finished in 1825, connected the Hudson River to Lake Erie, creating a water route from New York City to the Great Lakes and the developing American interior. This engineering marvel reduced shipping costs dramatically and made New York the logical entry point for goods flowing between Europe and America's heartland. The port hummed with activity day and night. South Street, running along the East River, was the heart of maritime commerce. Here, counting houses, ship chandlers, sail lofts, rope walks, and warehouses crowded together. Merchants conducted business in coffee houses and counting rooms, negotiating deals worth thousands of dollars with nothing more than a handshake and their reputations. The Tontine Coffee House and the Merchants' Exchange served as unofficial centers of commerce where information about ship arrivals, cargo prices, and business opportunities circulated freely. Ships arriving from Liverpool, London, Le Havre, Canton, and Calcutta brought manufactured goods, textiles, tea, spices, porcelain, and luxury items that American manufacturers could not yet produce competitively. Outbound vessels carried cotton from southern plantations, grain from western farms, and manufactured goods from New York's own growing industries. The packet ships, regular scheduled service between New York and European ports, gave the city a competitive advantage over rival ports like Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Banking and finance were emerging as major industries. The Bank of New York, founded in 1784, and newer institutions like the Manhattan Company competed for deposits and loan business. The stock market, though primitive by modern standards, operated informally at 40 Wall Street and then, after 1827, in its own building on Wall and Hanover Streets. Stocks, bonds, and commodity futures traded hands, though speculation and manipulation were common, and panics occurred with frightening regularity. Manufacturing was expanding rapidly. New York produced goods ranging from books and newspapers to furniture, clothing, shoes, and machinery. Small workshops and manufactories employed skilled craftsmen who often lived above or near their places of work. The putting out system, where merchants supplied raw materials to workers who produced finished goods in their homes, was common in the garment industry. This early form of industrialization exploited workers, especially women and immigrants, who labored long hours for minimal wages. The retail sector was evolving beyond traditional general stores and specialty shops. At Stewart would soon revolutionize retailing with his Marble Palace department store, but in 1830 most shopping took place in smaller establishments. Broadway hosted the most fashionable shops selling imported goods, millinery, jewelry, and books. Public markets like Fulton Market, Washington Market, and Center Market provided fresh food, with farmers and merchants setting up stalls to sell produce, meat, fish, and dairy products. Street vendors added color and chaos to commercial life. Peddlers sold everything imaginable: hot corn, oysters, strawberries, flowers, used clothes, trinkets, and patent medicines. Their cries, hot corn, created a constant soundtrack to city life. Many vendors were immigrants or free black New Yorkers who found street selling one of the few economic opportunities available to them. Labor organization was in its infancy. Journeymen and skilled workers in trades like carpentry, printing, and tailoring formed early unions to negotiate wages and working conditions. These organizations faced fierce opposition from employers and operated in a legal gray area. Strikes occurred, but were risky. Employers could easily replace strikers with the constant stream of newcomers arriving in the city. Wealth inequality was stark and growing. A small merchant elite controlled vast fortunes made from shipping, real estate, and finance. The Astors, Galettes, Rhinelanders, and other families were accumulating the wealth that would sustain their descendants for generations. Meanwhile, thousands of workers struggled to earn enough for basic necessities. There was no social safety net, no unemployment insurance, no worker protections. Poverty meant genuine hardship, and economic downturns could push families from precarious stability into destitution within weeks. Real estate speculation was already a New York obsession. Wealthy individuals and syndicates purchased undeveloped land in northern Manhattan, betting that the city's growth would eventually make these investments immensely profitable. They were correct. Fortunes were made by those with the capital to purchase land and the patience to wait for development to reach it. Chapter 4: Social Structure, Class, and Diversity. New York in 1830 was a city of profound social divisions, but also surprising diversity and fluidity. The rigid class structures of Europe had loosened somewhat in America, yet hierarchies of wealth, occupation, ethnicity, and race still structured daily life and determined opportunities. At the apex of society stood the old merchant families and the newly rich who were joining their ranks. These families, the Livingstons, Van Rensselaers, Schuylers from Old Dutch stock, along with newer arrivals like the Astors, formed a self-conscious elite. They built grand homes, collected art, patronized theaters, and attempted to establish themselves as America's aristocracy, their sheep. They married among themselves, attended the same churches, often Episcopalian or Dutch Reformed, and belonged to exclusive social clubs. Their sons attended Columbia College or traveled to Europe for education and culture. The middle class was expanding rapidly, fueled by commercial growth. This group included successful merchants, lawyers, doctors, ministers, editors, and master craftsmen who owned their own shops. They valued respectability, hard work, piety, and education. Their homes might be modest compared to the elite, but they were comfortable and respectable. They attended church faithfully, often joining the evangelical Protestant denominations that were gaining strength. They read books and newspapers, attended lectures, and participated in reform movements aimed at improving society. Working-class New Yorkers formed the majority of the population. Skilled craftsmen, carpenters, masons, printers, tailors occupied the upper tier of this class, earning decent wages when work was available and maintaining some independence. Below them labored the unskilled workers, dock workers, cartmen, servants, washerwomen, and day laborers. These people lived precarious existences, vulnerable to economic downturns, illness, and injury. Women in this class often worked as domestic servants, seamstresses, hortenses, or laundresses, earning a fraction of male wages. Immigration was transforming the city's character. While the massive Irish and German immigration of the 1840s and 1850s had not yet begun, newcomers from Ireland, England, Germany, and France were arriving steadily. The Irish, even in 1830, faced particular discrimination. Protestant New Yorkers viewed them with suspicion because of their Catholicism, their poverty, and their supposed tendency toward drunkenness and violence. The Irish clustered in neighborhoods like 5 Points, which was already developing a reputation as a slum. African Americans formed a significant but oppressed minority. New York had formally abolished slavery in 1827, just 3 years before 1830, making it one of the last northern states to do so. However, freedom did not mean equality. Black New Yorkers faced systematic discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations. They could not vote, a property requirement effectively disenfranchised them, could not serve on juries, and faced violence and harassment. Despite these obstacles, Black New Yorkers built institutions to serve their community: churches, mutual aid societies, and schools. The African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, founded in 1796, served as a center of Black community life and a hub of abolitionist activity. Black-owned businesses existed, though they faced hostility from white competitors. Educated Black leaders like Samuel Cornish, who founded Freedom's Journal, America's first Black newspaper in 1827, fought for rights and dignity. Still, opportunities remained severely limited, and many Black New Yorkers worked in menial positions, as domestic servants, laborers, or in service industries. Gender roles were strictly defined. Women, regardless of class, lived under significant legal and social restrictions. Married women had no legal identity separate from their husbands. They could not own property, sign contracts, or keep their own earnings. A woman's sphere was the home, where she was expected to create a moral sanctuary for her husband and children. Middle-class and wealthy women might have some education, but their schooling emphasized accomplishments: music, French, drawing, rather than serious intellectual development. Working-class women had no choice but to work outside the home, though their options were limited and their wages were minimal. Domestic service employed thousands of women, both white and Black. Seamstresses, milliners, and other needle workers labored in workshops or at home. Prostitution, though illegal and socially condemned, provided income for women who had few other options, especially widows, abandoned wives, or immigrants with no family support. Children's lives varied enormously by class. Wealthy children enjoyed protected childhoods with education, play, and parental indulgence. Middle-class children attended school and were expected to develop moral character and useful skills. Working-class children, however, often worked from young ages, contributing to family income as soon as they were able. Child labor in workshops, as street vendors, or in domestic service was common and unremarkable. Formal education for poor children was limited, though charity schools and Sunday schools provided basic literacy to some. Social mobility existed but was difficult to achieve. Ambitious young men could rise through hard work, business success, marriage, or luck, but the odds were against them. More commonly, people remained in the class into which they were born, though economic volatility meant that downward mobility was always possible. Chapter 5. Culture, Entertainment, and Intellectual Life. Cultural life in 1830 New York was rich and varied, reflecting the city's growing wealth and self-confidence. The city aspired to rival European cultural capitals, though many cultivated New Yorkers still looked to London and Paris as the arbiters of taste and refinement. Theater was the most popular form of public entertainment, appealing to all classes, though different theaters catered to different audiences. The Park Theater, rebuilt after a fire in 1820, was the city's premier playhouse, attracting wealthy patrons who occupied the boxes and enjoyed performances of Shakespeare, contemporary comedies, and melodramas. The pit, with cheaper tickets, drew a rowdier crowd of clerks, apprentices, and working men who were not shy about expressing their opinions of performances through applause, jeers, or thrown objects. The Bowery Theater, opened in 1826, deliberately courted working-class audiences with spectacular productions, star actors, and affordable prices. The theater audiences in 1830 were far more participatory than modern theater-goers. They talked, ate, drank, moved around, and sometimes rioted if they disapproved of a performance or ticket prices. The theater was as much a social experience as an artistic one. Other entertainment venues included circus performances, museums featuring curiosities and oddities, and concert halls. John Scudder's American Museum displayed exotic animals, wax figures, and unusual artifacts, combining education and entertainment in ways that would be perfected by P.T. Barnum in later years. Musical performances ranged from classical concerts for elite audiences to popular songs performed in saloons and pleasure gardens. Reading was a passion among educated New Yorkers. Bookstores and lending libraries made literature accessible to those who could not afford to purchase books. Newspapers proliferated. The city supported dozens of daily and weekly papers representing various political viewpoints. The New York Evening Post, edited by William Cullen Bryant, and James Gordon Bennett's papers reached wide audiences. These newspapers mixed news, political commentary, commercial information, and sensational crime stories. Magazines like the Knickerbocker and North American Review published essays, stories, and poetry, creating a venue for American writers. Washington Irving, though he spent much time in Europe, remained New York's most celebrated author. His stories of the Hudson River Valley and satirical histories had established him as America's first internationally recognized writer. Literary and philosophical societies brought together educated men to discuss ideas, hear lectures, and debate current issues. The New York Historical Society, founded in 1804, collected materials relating to American history. The Mercantile Library Association provided books and lectures to young clerks and merchants eager for self-improvement. These institutions reflected the American faith in education and progress. Religious life was intense and varied. The Second Great Awakening, a wave of evangelical Protestant revivalism, was sweeping through American cities, including New York. Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian churches were growing rapidly, emphasizing personal conversion, moral reform, and missionary work. Charles Grandison Finney, the great revivalist preacher, would soon conduct dramatic revival campaigns in New York that drew thousands. Older, more established denominations, Episcopalian, Dutch Reformed, Quaker, maintained their congregations but faced competition from the energetic evangelicals. The Catholic Church was growing with Irish immigration, though Catholics faced prejudice from the Protestant majority. The city's small but significant Jewish population maintained synagogues and community institutions, while navigating between maintaining traditions and integrating into American society. Churches were not merely places of worship, but centers of social life and reform activity. Many reform movements of the era, temperance, abolitionism, moral reform, Sabbatarianism, originated in or were supported by evangelical churches. The idea that society could and should be improved through organized effort motivated thousands of New Yorkers to join reform societies and campaigns. Visual arts were developing, though American painting and sculpture still lagged behind European work. Portrait painting remained the most reliable way for artists to earn a living, and successful portraitists like Samuel F.B. Morse, who would later invent the telegraph, painted wealthy New Yorkers. The National Academy of Design, founded in 1825, provided training and exhibition space for artists. Architecture was emerging as a profession distinct from building. The Greek Revival style dominated new construction, with its clean lines, columns, and democratic associations. Public buildings, banks, and wealthy homes adopted this style enthusiastically. The City Hall, completed in 1812 in a French Renaissance style, remained the city's grandest public building. Public celebrations and holidays brought New Yorkers together across class lines, though often in segregated spaces. The 4th of July featured parades, speeches, fireworks, and widespread drinking. Washington's birthday was observed with patriotic ceremonies. Firefighting companies, militia units, and fraternal organizations marched in parades, displaying their uniforms and equipment with pride. Taverns, oyster houses, and coffee houses served as informal social centers where men gathered to drink, eat, talk politics, and conduct business. Women of respectable classes did not frequent such establishments, though working-class women might visit certain taverns. Ice cream gardens and pleasure gardens like Niblo's Garden offered outdoor entertainment where families could stroll, hear music, and enjoy refreshments in summer. Chapter 6. Politics, Governance, and Reform Movements. Political life in 1830. New York was passionate, chaotic, and deeply consequential. The city served as a battleground for competing political factions and as a laboratory for democratic politics that would influence the entire nation. The presidential election of 1828 had brought Andrew Jackson to power, overthrowing the established order represented by John Quincy Adams. Jackson's victory represented the triumph of a more democratic, populist politics over the older, more elitist system. In New York, this political transformation was embodied in the conflict between different Democratic factions and the declining Federalist Party. Martin Van Buren, the Little Magician, was the master politician of New York and a key Jackson supporter. He had built the Albany Regency, a sophisticated political machine that controlled state politics through patronage, party discipline, and organizational skill. Van Buren pioneered techniques of party organization and mass mobilization that would define American politics for generations. Tammany Hall, officially the Society of St. Tammany, was evolving from a fraternal organization into a powerful political machine. Located on Frankfort Street, Tammany Hall provided a social center for Democratic Party members and increasingly controlled nominations and elections through a combination of organization, patronage, and appeals to working class and immigrant voters. The corruption and boss rule that would later characterize Tammany were already emerging in embryonic form. Voting rights were expanding, but remained limited. The New York State Constitution of 1821 had eliminated property requirements for white male voters, while simultaneously imposing a discriminatory property requirement on black voters that effectively disenfranchised them. This contradiction, expanding democracy for whites while restricting it for blacks, characterized American politics in this era. Political campaigns were rowdy affairs featuring parades, mass rallies, barbecues, and copious amounts of alcohol. Political parties organized their supporters into marching companies, distributed partisan newspapers, and engaged in fierce rhetoric that sometimes spilled over into violence. Voting was not secret. Men voted by voice or by depositing colored ballots representing different parties into boxes, making their choices visible to all. City government struggled to keep pace with rapid growth. The Common Council, composed of aldermen and assistant aldermen elected by ward, handled everything from street paving to market regulations to fire protection. Corruption was endemic. Council members awarded contracts to political supporters, looked the other way when laws were violated in exchange for bribes, and used their positions for personal enrichment. The police force was primitive, consisting of a small number of constables and a night watch of dubious effectiveness. Reform movements challenged the political establishment and sought to improve society through moral persuasion and legal change. The temperance movement, driven by concerns about alcohol's destructive effects on families and workers, gained strength throughout the 1820s and 1830s. Reformers established temperance societies, published newspapers and tracts, and advocated for restrictions on alcohol sales. They faced opposition from those who viewed drinking as a personal choice and from the liquor industry itself. The abolitionist movement, though still small, was becoming more vocal and militant. New York had ended slavery in 1827, but this did not satisfy abolitionists who demanded the immediate end of slavery throughout the United States. Leaders like William Lloyd Garrison, Arthur and Lewis Tappan, and Samuel Cornish published newspapers, organized societies, and lectured against slavery. They faced violent opposition. Abolitionist meetings were broken up by mobs, and abolitionists themselves were threatened and sometimes attacked. Moral reform societies, often led by evangelical Protestant women, sought to combat prostitution and promote sexual purity. These reformers operated rescue homes for prostitutes, published literature warning of vice's dangers, and pressured authorities to enforce morality laws more strictly. Their work reflected growing concerns about urban immorality and women's increasing public activism. Educational reform attracted support from those who believed that universal public education was essential for democracy. New York had charity schools for poor children and private schools for those who could afford them, but no system of public education. Reformers argued that the state should provide free education to all children, regardless of class. This idea faced opposition from those who feared the cost and from parents who needed their children's labor. The condition of the poor and the need for better social welfare provisions were becoming visible problems. Private charity organizations, often affiliated with churches, provided limited relief to the destitute. The almshouse system confined the poor, sick, and mentally ill in grim institutions that offered basic subsistence but little hope of improvement. Reformers were beginning to argue for more humane and effective approaches. Women's rights as a distinct reform movement had not yet emerged, but the restrictions women faced were beginning to be questioned. Women's increasing involvement in reform movements, particularly temperance and abolitionism, was giving them organizational experience and public voices that would eventually lead to demands for political and legal equality. Chapter 7. Infrastructure, Public Health, and Urban Challenges. The rapid growth that made New York prosperous in 1830 also created severe infrastructure challenges and public health crises that the city struggled to address. Urban problems that would plague cities throughout the industrial age were already visible in New York's crowded streets and deteriorating neighborhoods. Transportation within the city relied on walking for most residents and horse-drawn vehicles for those who could afford them. Wealthy families owned private carriages, while middle-class residents might hire hackney coaches for special occasions. Omnibuses, large horse-drawn vehicles that ran on fixed routes and charged set fares, were just beginning to appear, though they would not become common until later in the 1830s. Most New Yorkers walked wherever they needed to go, making the compact size of the developed city essential. Streets themselves were in deplorable condition. Some main thoroughfares were paved with cobblestones, but many streets remained unpaved dirt roads that turned to mud in rain and created choking dust in dry weather. The city lacked a coordinated system of street cleaning, and residents often simply threw garbage, waste, and chamber pot contents into the streets, where pigs, which roamed freely as unofficial sanitation workers, consumed what they could. The smell, especially in summer, was overpowering. Pigs were both solution and problem. They consumed organic waste but also created sanitation hazards, damaged property, and occasionally injured children. Periodic attempts to ban pigs from city streets met fierce resistance from poor residents who raised pigs as a source of food and income. The pig wars between authorities and pig owners epitomized the conflicts between public health concerns and working-class economic survival. Water supply remained the city's most critical infrastructure failure. As mentioned earlier, New Yorkers relied on wells, cisterns, and water vendors because no municipal water system existed. The inadequate water supply affected everything from cooking and cleaning to fire protection and public health. Plans for a municipal water system were discussed but not yet implemented. The Croton Aqueduct, which would finally bring clean water to the city, would not be completed until 1842. Fire was a constant terror. Buildings were primarily wooden construction, packed closely together, and heated by open fireplaces and candles. When fires started, they spread rapidly, and the inadequate water supply hampered firefighting efforts. New York relied on volunteer fire companies, which were as much social clubs and political organizations as emergency services. Firefighters competed for glory, sometimes fighting each other while buildings burned, and their effectiveness varied widely. Several devastating fires struck New York during this period. The Great Fire of 1835, just a few years after 1830, would destroy hundreds of buildings in the commercial district and demonstrate the city's vulnerability. Fire insurance companies, recognizing the risk, charged high premiums and sometimes refused to insure properties in dangerous areas. Public health was appalling by modern standards. Disease was endemic, and epidemics periodically swept through the crowded city. Cholera, yellow fever, typhoid, typhus, tuberculosis, and other diseases killed thousands. Medical understanding of disease transmission remained primitive. The germ theory of disease had not yet been developed, and many doctors still believed in miasma theory, which held that diseases were caused by bad air and foul odors. Sanitation was virtually non-existent. Human waste was deposited in outdoor privies that frequently overflowed, contaminating wells and spreading disease. Dead animals rotted in streets. Industrial waste from tanneries, slaughterhouses, and other businesses poured into the East River and Hudson River. The poor water supply meant that personal cleanliness was difficult, and crowded living conditions facilitated disease transmission. Infant and child mortality rates were shockingly high. Perhaps 1 in 4 children died before age 5, with deaths from diarrheal diseases, respiratory infections, and childhood diseases like measles and scarlet fever. Poor nutrition, inadequate heating, and lack of medical care made working-class children especially vulnerable. Medical care was rudimentary and often dangerous. Doctors had limited training, medical education was haphazard, and anyone could hang out a shingle and claim to be a physician. Treatments included bleeding, purging, and the administration of toxic substances like mercury and arsenic. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptic technique, making it agonizing and frequently fatal due to infection. Hospitals existed but were generally places of last resort where the poor went to die. Bellevue Hospital, New York Hospital, and a few other institutions provided care, but they were crowded, unsanitary, and staffed by underpaid workers. Wealthy people received medical care at home from private physicians. Mental illness was poorly understood and harshly treated. The mentally ill were confined in almshouses, jails, or the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum, where treatment consisted primarily of confinement and sometimes physical restraint. The idea that mental illness could be treated medically was just emerging. Crime was a serious concern, particularly in poor neighborhoods like Five Points. The city had no professional police force. Law enforcement consisted of constables, marshals, and a night watch that was widely considered ineffective and often corrupt. Criminals operated with relative impunity, and violent crime, theft, and fraud were common. Middle-class New Yorkers increasingly feared the poor neighborhoods they viewed as dens of vice and danger. Prostitution flourished despite being illegal. Brothels operated openly in certain neighborhoods, and streetwalkers solicited customers in public spaces. Efforts to suppress prostitution through arrests and moral suasion had limited effect, as poverty and lack of economic opportunities drove women to sex work. Gangs of young men, organized by neighborhood or ethnicity, engaged in turf battles, political thuggery, and crime. These gangs would become more organized and powerful in later decades. But even in 1830, they were a visible and troubling presence. Despite these challenges, New York continued to grow and prosper. The city's problems were the problems of success. Rapid growth, industrialization, and immigration created difficulties that no American city had faced before. The solutions to these problems, professional police forces, public health departments, building codes, zoning laws, public education, social welfare programs, would be developed slowly and painfully over the coming decades. Conclusion. New York in 1830 was a city of extraordinary contrasts and tremendous energy. It was simultaneously sophisticated and crude, wealthy and impoverished, orderly and chaotic. The city stood at a pivotal moment, transitioning from a commercial port city to an industrial metropolis that would dominate American economic and cultural life. The physical city was compact, but growing explosively northward. The street grid was being imposed on the landscape, though much of Manhattan remained undeveloped countryside. The waterfront bustled with ships from around the world, and the recent completion of the Erie Canal had secured New York's position as America's gateway to both Europe and the developing West. Daily life varied enormously by class, with a small elite enjoying luxuries while many workers struggled for basic necessities. The rhythms of life followed natural patterns of light and seasons, and manual labor dominated most people's existence. Domestic life was labor-intensive, with cooking, cleaning, and laundry requiring hours of hard physical work. The economy was dynamic and growing, driven by trade, finance, and manufacturing. The port anchored the city's prosperity, but banking, insurance, and manufacturing were becoming increasingly important. Wealth inequality was stark, and economic insecurity was a fact of life for most residents. Society was stratified by class, ethnicity, and race, but also characterized by diversity and a degree of social mobility unusual for the time. Immigration was beginning to transform the city, and the recent abolition of slavery had created a free black community that faced discrimination but maintained its own institutions and culture. Cultural and intellectual life was rich, with theaters, newspapers, libraries, and reform movements providing entertainment, information, and opportunities for improvement. Religious revivals swept through the city, and reform movements sought to address social problems through moral persuasion and organized effort. Political life was passionate and participatory, with expanding democracy for white men coinciding with continued exclusion of women and black New Yorkers. Political machines were developing, and the techniques of mass democratic politics that would characterize American politics for generations were being pioneered. Infrastructure and public health challenges were severe and growing worse as the city expanded. The lack of clean water, adequate sanitation, and effective disease control made urban life dangerous, particularly for the poor. Crime, fire, and epidemics threatened residents, and the city's government struggled to keep pace with growth. New York in 1830 was a city of tremendous promise and serious problems. A place where fortunes could be made and lives could be lost, where democratic ideals coexisted with profound inequalities. It was recognizably modern in its commercial dynamism, diversity, and cultural ambitions, yet still tied to patterns of life that had changed little in centuries. The city that would become the world's greatest metropolis was emerging, but much transformation lay ahead. The New York of 1830 was not the city we know today, but it contained the seeds of that future greatness, along with all the problems that would accompany it.